It's such a pleasure to see you guys all here together again for our last in-person event for the semester. It's a special treat to have with us today our newest addition to the Iran Center family, who is Sheragim Jenabzadeh, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before doing that, I want to say that we have one last event for the semester's program of talks, which will take place via Zoom next week. So Arya Fani, who is a professor of Persian literature at the University of Washington, will be joining us via Zoom next week. So even though we won't be seeing you guys here and we won't have any food for you, please do join us via Zoom. The details will be sent out in our email list. So for anyone who's not on the list, I'm sure you all are, seeing who's in the room, please do sign up for the list to see the details for the talk. Also, because it's a Zoom event, if any of you have colleagues who you think might be interested in attending, do let them know. It's an event that will be open to the public, and it'd be terrific to have Arya come and speak about his forthcoming book. But without any further ado, it's a delight and a pleasure to welcome Sheragim Jenabzadeh today to speak about his research. Sheragim just completed his PhD at the University of Toronto under the supervision of Jenny Jenkins and Mohammed Tavakoli. You might remember Jenny as having been here last year at the center where she was a visiting fellow. And now we get to see some of the most exciting work that's presently being done in the field of 20th century Iranian history, in particular as it relates to global history. Sheragim is a scholar both of Iranian history and of German studies. And today he's going to be sharing with us work that stems from his recently defended dissertation, and now his book project. Today's talk is entitled Visions of Youth for a Future Iran, Iranian Students in Interwar Germany. Those of us who work in Iranian studies know that this period of is sort of instrumental in the shaping of sort of the 20th century paradigm of writing Iranian history, but very few scholars have the skills that Sheragim does to work both in the Iranian and in the German archives, and so we're incredibly delighted to welcome him here today to share his research with us. Please join me in welcoming Sheragim.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to everyone for coming today. In early 1925, Hassan Nafisi, a young Iranian studying law and political science in France, sent 2 articles titled Feminism, which he had translated into Persian as Nisvan Navazi, to be published in a Berlin-based student journal, Name Farangistan. Nafisi staked a claim for the youth of Iran to shape the future of their nation and to embody the social mores incumbent for an Iran that was modern and nationally united. In the article, he wrote, quote, "According to natural laws, the worshippers of all things old, kohne parast, are condemned to be eliminated. The healthy and progressive youth, Jawanha, will take their place. The day when we take over the reins of Iran's destiny and through our sheer will impose our ideas on society is not too far away. That day, the young daughters of Iran, through the refinement of their character and the enlightenment of their thoughts, will work with us to accomplish freedom for themselves. To bring about a future Iran that was able to compete on the international stage, relinquish the capitulations to Western powers, and assert itself as a sovereign state, Nafisi called for the overturning of habits that had divided men and women, hindered national unity, and maintained outmoded traditions. While clearly a masculinist project of gender reform, he called for the removal of the veil, an end to the practice of polygamy, and gender equality before the law in the economy, in occupation, and politics. Nafisi hoped that through such reforms and the integration of women into public life would lay the foundation for a true Iranian nationalism, Vatan Parasti. But the call for gender reform and its connections to modernity was not new. Such calls were found in journals such as Iran Shahr and Kalve, two other journals that were published in Berlin during the 1910s and 20s, and indeed in modernist discourses from the 19th century and the Constitutional Revolution. What was different about the articles of Nafisi on women's emancipation, and indeed in articles by other students in Nameh Farangistan that focused on themes of technological development, political consciousness, and education reform, among others, was the emphasis on the inevitability of change as a result of generational turnover, and importantly, on youth as a conceptual antithesis to backwardness, political laxity, and traditional and religious dogma, chiefly represented by the clergy in Iran. Nafisi's call for gender and religious reform was but one of a series of approaches to questions of Iranian sovereignty, modernity, and nation-making by a younger generation who would either become architects of the Pahlavi state and proponents of its modernist program, or its opponents in the decades to follow. These two groups were especially represented by two journals published in Berlin, one of which was Nameh Farangistan from 1924 to 25, and the other Peykar during February to October of 1931. Traveling on their own initiative or through scholarships to attain technical and scientific knowledge to be used in the modernization drive of the Iranian state and its expanding industrial sector, Iranian students instead used Berlin as a space for the exploration of emerging ideologies, whether fascism or Soviet Bolshevism, first-hand observation of European modernity, ever so prized by Iranian reformers, and participation in global anti-imperial politics. But why was interwar Berlin the site of the formation of such groups, rather than Britain or France, where the majority of students went during this time? What do their writings tell us about the multiplicity of perspectives toward Iranian nation building when the Pahlavi regime was only in its nascent form? Why did so many students abroad become believers in the authoritarian modernist project of the regime and indeed contribute to its construction, while others came home and formed oppositional movements both abroad and upon their return? Moreover, rather than simply go abroad for the intention of knowledge attainment, how did Iranian students and diaspora contribute to the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the famed Weimar Republic and to its radicalization during its final years? Umid Iran and Nameh Farangistan. Nameh Farangistan was established by a group of Iranian students in their early 20s, calling themselves Umid Iran, or Hope of Iran. The members of the group were the editor of Farangistan, Mushfiq Kazemi, and included Ali Ardalan, Ahmad Farhad, Hassan Nafisi, Ghulam Hussein Furuhar, Ibrahim Mahdavi, Morteza Yazdi, and Parviz Kazemi. Occasional contributions to Farangistan were also made by Taqi Irani, who we will discuss a bit further. Unlike students sent to Europe during the 1920s, who were largely state-funded, the late 1920s, who were largely state-funded, these students came from Qajars, the Qajar dynasty's emerging middle class, whose fathers were often governmental officials in this dynasty, and now in the early years of Reza Khan's rule, and who were able to financially support their sons' education abroad. They exhibited characters of middle-class culture, that is, the promotion of education, the sciences, civic engagement, and the rule of law. Like their fathers, upon their return to Iran, a number of Umid Iran members would become prominent officials and civil servants within the evolving Pahlavi regime. So here we have a couple of photos. On the far left, Mushfiq Kazemi is standing on the far left. Next to him is Ali Ardalan. And to the right with the mustache, that's Ahmad Farhad and Ghulam Hussein Furuhar. And this one right here, that's again Mushfiq Kazemi, Parviz Kazemi, and Ghulam Hussein Furuhar. Mushfiq Kazemi studied political science at Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin. When he returned to Iran, he joined the Young Iran Society, Jamiyat Iran Javan, which had other European educated intellectuals as members, and wrote for their organ Young Iran, Iran Javan, aptly named with the goal of rejuvenating the country through cultural and economic reform. He would also have a successful career in Iranian foreign ministry as the ambassador to Syria and Sweden. Perhaps the most notable of the group is Ali Ardalan. He also studied in Berlin's university. In 1926, he graduated with a degree in political science and began his doctoral degree with a dissertation titled The Position of Persia in the World Economy. Understandably, if a bit egotistical, he positioned his own travel to Europe as part of Iranian efforts to become self-sufficient through the attainment of Western knowledge. However, likely influenced by the increasing Asian and African student body in German universities, Ardalan argued that for the independence of Iran, it was essential for the country to expand its trade networks beyond Western countries and build closer ties with African and Asian states such as China, Japan, Egypt, and Turkey, among others. Indeed, the post-World War I world, the post-World War I global order rather, with the downfall of the Russian Empire, an embattled British Empire, increasing anti-colonial groups, and national independence movements, offered Iran a myriad of possibilities to expand its global economic networks beyond the West. Ardalan's career following his return to Iran included becoming managing director of the National Iranian Oil Company, as well as several positions within the foreign ministry, such as ambassador to the US, to the USSR, to West Germany at different points during his career. His support for the Pahlavi regime extended to the final days of the dynasty, when at the age of 80, and as minister of the imperial court, Ardalan was one of 9 members of the Regency Council tasked by Mohammad Reza Shah to rule in his absence in 1979. Other members of Umid Iran also attained prominent positions. During the 40s and 50s, Ghulam Hossein Forougha held several positions, including Minister of Roads and Urban Development, Minister of Industry and Mining, and Minister of Finance. Ahmad Farhad, after receiving his doctorate in radiology, returned to Iran, bringing back with him radiographic equipment serviceable in Iran's expanding health industry. In 1940, he became professor of physics, medicine, and radiology in the newly founded University of Tehran, and eventually its chancellor. But rather than simply attend classes and enjoy the sights and attractions of Europe and return home with degrees in hand, these students used their time to stake a claim for the future of Iran. They envisioned Name Farangistan as an ethnographic study on European modernity, with the aim of, quote, to aid to the best of our efforts in the intellectual development of our people who are not aware of Europe and the New World, end quote. Articles in the journal reflected on European interwar developments, from ideological movements, technological and scientific developments, programs and institutions in Weimar Germany, such as democratic campaigning, educational and physical institutions, workers' rights, and the changing of women in post-war Europe. But their political project was not simply for the Europeanization of Iran. Indeed, at times they questioned the unbridled love for all things European by Iranian officials at the time. Each of the students presented a different perspective on European society and what Iran needed to compete on the international stage. While Mushfiq Kazemi's articles focused on anti-clericalism, colonial politics, and fascism, Ali Ardalan focused on the importance of economic financial strategy, as well as using Germany's post-war hyperinflation issues as a focus of economic strategy, and Soviet collectivization. As for the other members, Forougha wrote on the history of socialism and public education. Ahmad Farhad focused on the new woman and electoral practices, emphasizing the importance of each individual role in self-cultivation for a broader national development. Ibrahim Mahdavi wrote on agricultural techniques, Parviz Kazemi on the importance of physical education and the formation of new modern men and women, and Nafisi on gender and youth as seen at the beginning of our talk. It is curious, though, why with so many students going to France and Britain during the same time, it was Germany that became the center of political and revolutionary publications. One reason was perhaps Germany's own recent past as a champion of revolutionary politics. This was during World War I when the German Empire and the Foreign Office within it invited Iranian, Indian, Georgian, and other nationalities to Berlin to set up revolutionary committees intended to incite rebellion within these empires so that Germany would essentially have an easier time during the war since it was facing a two-front war. This was the same program in which the Foreign Office actually found Vladimir Lenin in Zurich at the time and put him on German trains and shipped him off to through Russia at that time, Tsarist Russia, to seed discord, and eventually that would come back to haunt Germany within a couple of decades, actually. It was this same revolutionary program that brought Iranian constitutionalist Hassan Taqizadeh and a host of other Iranians, including Hossein Kazemzadeh and Mohammad Ali Jamalzadeh, to Berlin and the forming of the Persian Committee. The journal that they published, Kaveh, promoted German and Ottoman interests during the war and urged Iranians to support the Central Powers in the hope that they would also support Iranian sovereignty and independence at the end of the war. When this journal came to an end in 1922, it was replaced by Iran Shah, headed by Hossein Kazemzadeh, and it was financed through private initiative and supported by former Iranian parliamentarians and the merchant community in Germany. The journal also found supporters and readers outside of the Iranian community, from India, Egypt, Lebanon, Kuwait, and Iraq, to Turkey, Afghanistan, and even the Philippines. Its subscriptions during the first year were around 200, but by the end of its fourth year, it reached over 1,000. The cover of Iran Shah was also designed by Karim Tahirzadeh Behzad, who was the architect behind the Ferdowsi Mausoleum. An Iranian press by the name of Kaviani, with Persian typesets, was also founded in Berlin by Mirza Abdul Shakur, publishing both Kaveh and the short stories of Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh, Yeki Bud, Yeki Nabud. The Kaviani press contributed to the proliferation of Persian, Urdu, and Arabic texts in Weimar Germany by Asian migrants to Europe. Mushfiq had read Jamalzadeh's work prior to his arrival to Germany. He later said that he was, quote, engrossed by Jamalzadeh's power of writing and way of thought. It was through his growing friendship with Jamalzadeh and Kazemzadeh that Mushfiq was connected to the Kaviani press, which would go on to publish Name Farangistan as well. The diasporic community of Iranians that already resided in Germany, itself largely facilitated by Germany's foreign policy interests, enabled the political and intellectual projects of young Iranians. A second reason, however, why Germany became the site for diasporic publications was the cheap living expenses and printing costs due to the hyperinflation of the German currency, the Reichsmark. Cheap living expenses also meant inexpensive tuition costs for foreigners exchanging currencies. Iranian students, for instance, used British pounds to exchange into the Reichsmark, which gave them very, very favorable exchange rates. This allowed Omid Iran members to live extravagant lifestyles, spend nights with their female companions and drinking champagne and attending expensive restaurants and such throughout the country, but also report on their observations. Ahmad Farhad's emphasis on the importance of cultivating the body and the self as prerequisites for national development was framed within a travelogue he had written while on a trip to a German village. Farhad was surprised that despite its small size and population of only 2,000, the village was fitted with up-to-date sporting facilities. More than that, there was a real sense of community as neighboring villages and their soccer teams had come to face the hometown heroes. After the match, Farhad noted the camaraderie between opposing teams and fan bases. The next day, local newspapers even reported on the match. He contrasted this with, quote, the moral degeneracy and the lack of exercise among Iranian youth, end quote. He established a link between national degeneration and, quote, the depletion of youthful energies, end quote. I should note that this was also a prominent fear among Iranian reformers at the time, that the project to construct a productive and disciplined society would be undermined by individual laxity. For Farhad, the cultivation of the individual was therefore perceived to be foundational for the construction of a modern and sovereign state. Through sport, Iranians would learn how to cooperate with one another, but also have a healthy desire for competition, which was, of course, necessary for a state to survive in the 20th century, especially in the post-war world. Farhad declared that, quote, anyone who cares about the welfare of Iranians must encourage its athletes and work to grow sports culture in Iran. Iran will not become prosperous through democracy, moderate parties, or socialism. Let us become pahlavan, athletes, for Iran to become prosperous, end quote. His friend, Parviz Kazemi, who also traveled extensively, agreed with this, but also pointed to the importance of sports as a preventative measure against pathogens. Now, rather than advocating just for the import of Western medicine and the construction of hospitals, for Parviz Kazemi, the promotion of physical activity could actually better serve Iranians in the immediate moment. This was because in the recent past, Iran had suffered numerous epidemics. Typhus and smallpox had spread around the Caspian coast, the plague had broken out in the Persian Gulf, and urban centers had been beset with cholera. Added to this was the fact that even with the availability of modern techniques, such as vaccination, many Iranian peasants simply refused to get them, perhaps distrusting the central government or due to superstitious belief. Sport, therefore, had the immediate impact of putting people's health back into their hands and relieving the still limited Iranian state of having to provide extensive hygienic and medical services. Travel and first-hand encounters made the necessity of such reforms all the more salient. No less can be said of the encounter between young Iranians, men, and German women. By their own admission, Iranian students often hung out at bars and restaurants, mostly on the fashionable Kurfürstendamm Boulevard, discussing daily events and Iranian issues with one another in Persian. In the company of the opposite sex, however, they were forced to practice their German, come out of their shells, and engage further with the local culture. One late, cool, and crisp spring night in Berlin, Mushfiq came by a bustling dance hall, one of many such establishments that had opened in the post-war German capital. With bands playing the latest American jazz music, in this case, Frank Silver's 1923 hit, Yes, We Have No Bananas, with drinks making their rounds on the dance floor, scantily clad women dancers taking stage. Such establishments were one of the favorite entertainment venues of Berlin's young and adventure-seeking crowd. Observing the hustle and bustle of the place, with ladies taking initiative in taking their male counterparts to the dance floor, Mushfiq wondered whether such experiences would be possible in Iran. If young men and women were seen dancing, flirting, laughing in public spaces together, surely, he thought, they would be railed against and excommunicated by Muslim clerics. Such were the problems of youth in Iran a century ago. Study abroad, however, allowed students to experience mixed public interactions, normalize it, and interact with the new woman, which was itself in the process of being fashioned and contested in Weimar Germany. While popular depictions of Weimar, whether in popular shows such as Babylon Berlin, in artwork, or other movies, show it to have been an era of sexual liberty, freedom of expression, and the embracing of the trendiest fashions and music, in reality, these emerging changes to society were hotly contested. On the one hand, the new woman that was praised by Mushfiq Kazemi for her, quote, practical short haircut, colored hair and nails, and socializing at ease late into the night, was, on the other hand, condemned by post-war German conservatives as the degeneration and Americanization of German society. The artwork on the right, for instance, really seeks to capture this by essentially depicting a masculinized German woman in the Weimar Republic. While Omid Iran praised the new woman and published images of women athletes and women on motorcycles, German conservatives denounced them as motoring Amazons, women robbed of their natural female sexuality. For Iranian students, however, the new German woman displayed youthfulness, femininity, and independence as sign of modernity and progress, not degeneration. Mushfiq's own intimate relations with a young German woman convinced him of this. He had become acquainted with her through a friend. When she offered to give him language lessons, the relationship bloomed. During this time, she also invited Mushfiq and a few of his friends, presumably other members of Omid Iran, to her place for the celebration of Christmas and New Year's. When gatherings ran late into the night and the visitors missed the last tram home, she allowed them to spend the night. It was Platonic experiences such as these and the lack of social repercussion for both Iranian students and the young woman in question, and her independence in having a place of her own, made vivid to Mushfiq the changing attitudes toward women in post-war society. The ability of German women to enter into relationships on their own accord with the opposite sex was contrasted by Mushfiq with Iranian attitudes toward women in their temporary marriage and fashion as the, quote, the trafficking of women for sexual pleasure. This freedom also meant that relationships between men and women were reciprocal. Feelings of companionship and friendship could be reciprocated by women towards the men. This was perhaps a key reason why the new woman proved so attractive to young men. While Omid Iran presented a variety of prescriptions into how Iran could become a progressive nation state in a holistic manner, rather than simply through the import of machinery, factories, and fashion, some of the students, especially Mushfiq, were gravely skeptical about the possibility of reform, whether top-down with the existing officials in power, or through self-cultivation as advocated by Ahmad Farhad and Parviz Kazemi. In their view, old habits died hard. One key event that reinforced this belief was the failure to establish a republic by Reza Khan during 1923 and 1924. The opposition was largely led by the ulama, the bazaris, and their lay supporters, who feared that through the establishment of secularism, there would be an anti-religious movement against the ulama and Islam itself. And the fact that the Turkish Republic had recently eliminated the office of the caliphate, convinced them of this. Another key event was the killing of Robert Embry, an American consul in Iran in the summer of 1924. A mob had attacked him, believing him to be a Baha'i who was defiling a sacred well in Tehran. The event was reported in Farangistan by Mortaza Yazdi, who had actually found out about the event in a German newspaper, which had showed that this caused a general sensation in the media in the West that an American consul was killed by an Iranian mob. The event and the media's reporting of it in the West had suggested that Reza Khan may have been complicit in the crime, since the military had simply stood by and watched the attack. The death of Embry made apparent to students that the root of the problem was not with the Qajar dynasty, which had proved ineffective in pushing forward secularization of society. The root of the problem was an older generation of Iranians who continued to conform, acquiesce to religious authority. What was especially damning to them, however, was that the so-called modernist project pronounced by Sayyid Zia following the coup d'etat of Reza Khan was far from being actualized. In a joint statement, the writers of Farangistan called for the separation of religion from politics, an end to religious dogma, which restricted new modes of social conduct between men and women, and essentially publishing cartoons of clerics, which eventually caused the banning of the journal in Iran by the Iranian government. This in turn fueled the belief by the students that there needed to be some sort of revolution to transform a stagnating Iranian society ruled by, quote, rotten fossils. For Mushfiq, the answer was in a new movement that embraced youth, new ideas, led by a leader who had a vision to uproot society and transform it, and who represented a new man of the age. Mussolini's fascist Italy represented such a model. The authoritarian and fascist dictums of Mussolini to wholly transform Italy and make Italy unrecognizable to itself deeply resonated with Mushfiq. Fascist propaganda emphasized youthfulness of its movement, making a special place for young intellectuals born in the 20th century to partake in the rejuvenation of a young Italy. A clearly attractive doctrine for young Iranian students as well, who were to become industry leaders upon their return. Reza Khan did display some of these qualities, but when Omid Iran called for a new man who embodied the values of the age, the writers of Farangistan were pointing towards themselves. For immediately after proclaiming that only through a dictator could a societal transformation be successful, Mushfiq asserted that the educated youth had to take the reins of the nation's destiny and build it anew. In the spring of 1925, year after the start of its publication, Nameh Farangistan came to an end. With a stabilizing Reichsmark, the free spending of Iranian students came to an end with it, and as the printing costs ran higher and higher. So Mushfiq Kazemi moved to France during this time because at that point it was cheaper to study there, and other papers such as Iran Shahr also came to an end in 1927 because cost of printing kept going higher and higher as the Reichsmark stabilized more and more, and Germany's relations with the West opened up even more, and economic and commercial relations were further increased. But despite the end to Farangistan, there continued to be a desire by the remaining students with the political issues of Iran. Ardalan, Forouhar, Mahdavi, Yazdi were joined by a new set of students. These were Mortaza Alavi, the one on the left, who was the older brother of the Iranian novelist Bozorg Alavi, Taghi Irani, this is a plaque in Berlin, who had also come to Berlin during this time, as well as Ahmad Asadi. Unfortunately, there's no photo of him anywhere in the archives that I looked at. All three of the students studied at Berlin University, with Alavi and Asadi studying economics and Irani studying chemistry. In the fall of 1925, these students, including the remaining ones from Umid-e-Iran, formed the Republican Revolutionary Party of Iran, Firqe Jumhuriye Enqilabiye Iran. Khalil Maliki, another future Iranian Marxist, also had affiliations with the group. Now, the aspirations of this group for political, social, and economic reform were not far removed from the values of Iranian modernists or those of Farangistan and Umid-e-Iran. They were for a republican state that was centralized, the removal of concessions to the West, the separation of religion from politics, the removal of the veil, the end to polygamy, and so forth. Yet, given that so much of their projects were in the process of being implemented by the newly established Reza Shah and the technocrats that surrounded him, it's curious as to why the RRPI came to oppose him so strongly and to publish a number of pamphlets against him and distribute them throughout Europe to the European press and political parties. In one such pamphlet, the group critiqued the continuation of absolutist politics and the poverty of the majority of Iran's population. Then, in a 40-page manifesto written in Persian and in French in the fall of 1927, the group talked of class struggle, the emergence of the bourgeoisie, the French Revolution, the formation of a working class, and the workers' revolution of Russia. They also condemned Reza Shah as a servant of British imperialism and as against popular demands of Iranians. This was a charge that didn't sit particularly well with the new regime that sought to show itself as a counter to the Qajar dynasty and the 1919 agreement with Britain that would have effectively made Iran a mandate state similar to similar to Jordan and Iraq, Syria for the French Empire. So what was the reason behind such language and opposition? Of course, the most direct answer for these pronouncements would be that they wholly believed in the importance of establishing a democratically run Iran. But the emergence of a leftist discourse and its mixture of revolutionary politics, combined with calls for democracy and republicanism, demonstrate the working through of ideologies and political outlooks by a young group of students in their mid-20s grappling with different paths towards an Iranian future. Despite claims by some scholars that the RRPI was a communist organization from the outset, or an offshoot of the Iranian Communist Party, there is no such evidence to support these claims. Like most university students, even today, the introduction to diverse political outlooks took place during their studies. For instance, Taqi Irani later noted that it was through Mortaza Alavi and Ahmad Asadi that he even came to read the Communist Manifesto in 1927. Just a couple of years before, in Name Farangistan, he had published an article on Azerbaijan calling for the need to protect its Aryan roots and its Aryan blood from an expanding Turkish republican state. Rather, given the increasing censorship of political discourse in Iran under Reza Shah's court minister Abdul Hussein Teymurtash, and the elimination of the Iranian Communist Party's networks within Iran, what Berlin offered was the space to engage with a variety of political ideologies and the networks to connect Iranian students to emerging transnational political groups. By the late 1920s, Berlin had become a key hub for international communist and anti-imperial activity. Most important for our talk, the League Against Imperialism, which had its headquarters in Berlin. It was also supported by the Soviet-sponsored Communist International, or Comintern. It was access to the resources of the League Against Imperialism and the extensive networks of the German Communist Party that gradually pushed the RRPI to adopt and propagate leftist political ideas. International rallies and conferences allowed Iranian students to propagate a message that Iran remained under British imperialism and that its supposed oppressive and dictatorial regime had turned Iran into an imperially dominated nation. Indeed, on February 10, 1926, rallies had taken place in Berlin in support of anti-colonial movements in both Syria and Morocco. According to archival material from the Prussian Interior Ministry, on the same day and in front of crowd of anti-colonialists, Ahmad Asadi gave a speech in which he declared that the only way Iranian freedom could be won was through, quote, the union of Persian workers and peasants with the international working class, end quote. The following year, in February 1927, the Brussels Congress took place, which established the League Against Imperialism. With 174 attendants from around the world, including Nehru on behalf of the Indian National Congress, Muhammad Hatta, the future vice president of an independent Indonesia, and with the support of people like Albert Einstein and Henry Barbusse, the Congress was attended by Mortaza Alavi and Ahmad Asadi, with Asadi putting forth a resolution in regard to Iran's own struggles with imperialism. It was through such networks that Iranian students were able to distribute their message within and beyond Europe. The RRPI's manifesto, written in 1927, was distributed in India, drawing the ire of Britain for its criticism of British imperial meddling in South Asian and Middle Eastern politics. More anti-Pahlavi pamphlets were published and distributed when Temur Taj took a tour of Europe in 1928, causing the court minister to request that German police take action against the students involved. German police did listen, and they were watching and monitoring anti-imperial and communist activity. The Pahlavi government's desire to extend its censorship policies beyond its own borders met a receptive ear in the German government. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Weimar Republic was becoming fractured by political and ideological divisions. The Federal Republic, ruled by centrist parties with authoritarian leanings, came into conflict with the state of Prussia, ruled by Social Democrats. The Social Democrats were increasingly coming into conflict with the German Communist Party, at times seeing them as even more of a threat than the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. The revolutionary networks in which Iranian students participated were contributing to the radicalization of Germany. It was under these conditions and the publication of Peykar, Struggle, the publication of Peykar became a point of contention between Iran and Germany and between the German federal government and the Prussian state government. In its first issue, Peykar took direct aim against the Pahlavi government and expressed its revolutionary message, writing, "Reza Khan's regime has used its power and arms to strike terror on the Iranian population and silence all voices of opposition. From abroad, we are raising our voice through this revolutionary journal, Nameh Enqelabi, and invite the Iranian nation, Millat Iran, to actively join our struggle." End quote. Urged by the Iranian government and seeking to preserve its commercial relations with Iran, German federal officials led efforts to find out the identity of all those involved in the publication and distribution of Peykar, its location of publication, its transnational connections, and to shut down its production. Following an investigation by the Iranian legation with the assistance of Berlin's police, they identified Mortaza Alavi, Khalil Maliki, Nasir Khan, Masoud Ansari, Mohammad Bahrami, Mortaza Yazdi, Ahmad Imami, and another student whose last name was only identified as Zahbi, as the students behind the publication of Peykar, Moreover, they informed the German Foreign Office that Peykar was funded by the Soviet Union. Ahmad Asadi at this point was on the run, hiding with the help of his German communist friends. Berlin police were unable to find him, despite breaking into several suspected residences. The Iranian legation also pressured the Afghan legation to fire Mortaza Alavi in the hopes that cutting off his financial means would force him to return home. And similar tactics were, of course, tried on other Iranian students involved with PECAR. Of course, those that were state-funded were easier to pressure to return home. Those who had private means were more difficult to coerce. To put further pressure on the German government, the Iranian legation threatened to also rescind the student missions to Weimar Germany, and even German investments in Iran. But the Prussian government and the German federal government were in conflict with one another. The democratically oriented Prussia saw the German federal government of becoming more and more authoritarian and reneging on its constitutional duties to the Weimar Republic, or as established at the beginning of the Weimar Republic by the Constitution in 1918. Thus, it resisted federal pressure to arrest all those involved, deport them, and ban the publication of the paper on the basis that these were simple students and they were Republicans. They were not revolutionaries. The German Foreign Office, however, was flabbergasted. How could the Prussian state claim that they were not revolutionaries? How could students come up with the vast sums of money needed to print so many issues of PECAR and fund their distribution throughout Europe, Iran, and other countries? Indeed, the Iranian minister to the Soviet Union even claimed that PECAR could be found on newspaper stands in Russia. The Foreign Office continued to make its case, denouncing Mortaza Alavi and those around the publication of PECAR as communists and therefore as a threat to the Weimar Republic. The Prussian state eventually gave in to the mounting pressure. Mortaza Alavi and 3 German communists involved in the distribution of PECAR and its message were taken to trial to answer for their activities for putting Germany's relations with Iran in danger. Over the course of 1931 and 1932, the German press criticized the Weimar Republic as now becoming an authoritarian state, the Prussian government for giving in to pressure, and the Iranian government as a despotic regime trying to control even Germany with its oppressive policies. So these are just 3 examples of numerous newspaper articles that were printed on it. The far left one, for instance, is titled Berlin Police on a Persian Hunt, Berliner Polizei auf Persierjagd, in the Berliner Zeitung, which essentially told of a story of Berlin police carrying out a cloak and dagger operation against suspects associated with PECAR. Montag Morgen published an article called The Offended Shah on the far right, the Persischer Shah fühlt sich beleidigt, which essentially denounced German action and found it astounding that a Republican judiciary based on the instigation of the Foreign Office would take away the freedom of speech of a few Iranians. And the middle one, 12 Uhr Blatt, is essentially saying for the Persian Shah, Berlin officials fight against Reza Khan's enemies. In another article titled The Triumph of the Persian Shah, in the Berlin paper Tagebuch, author C.Z. Klutzel wrote, quote, "We are oddly enough no longer living in a republic. There now presides in Wilhelmstrasse, the street where most of the governmental offices were located, an order that presents the lion with a saber. It is nonsense to let our notions of a modern state and government principles be overtaken by an Eastern country that still finds itself in Islamic medievalism," end quote. From another perspective, and with the growing power of National Socialism, the nationalist paper Der Angriff, The Attack, chose to blame the supposed Jewish German press for creating conflict between Germany and Reza Shah, who, quote, "comes from the northern province of Mazandaran, where to this day the Nordic blood of the ancient Persians, our racial relatives, is strong, and who kicked out the hedonistic Qajars, who had blown all of the nation's money in Paris out of the house," end quote. In the end, on April 4th, 1932, the court case titled Insult Against Monarch, Majestätsbeleidigungsprozess, came to an end. By this point, Mortaza Alavi was no longer in Germany, having escaped to the Soviet Union, where he would eventually die in one of the gulags in the purges of Stalin. The 3 German communists were fined and placed for 6 weeks in detention. The Weimar Republic had become home to Iranian intellectual communities who used this space to fashion their own visions for Iran. Iranian students who had arrived to learn technical and scientific knowledge to aid Iran's modernization process engaged with Berlin's political culture and transnational networks to fashion themselves as nation builders, social revolutionaries, and social visionaries, and political revolutionaries, all the while contributing to the radicalizing atmosphere of Weimar Germany. Many returned home with these identities intact. While some contributed to the construction of a Pahlavi state, others questioned whether authoritarian nationalism and modernization were really the best way to attain Iranian sovereignty and to lift the living conditions of its population. In May 1937, Iranian police raided the residences of suspected communists. Among those arrested, who became known as the Group of 53, were members of the RRPI who had returned home, chief among them Taghi Irani. In response to the trial, Reza Shah was reported to have said, quote, "Look at this group of young people who we sent abroad with a heart full of hope and who were supported for years so that they could return to their homeland and serve it. Now that they are back, they brought us Bolshevism in their saddlebags." Thank you.
Thank you, Sheragim. That was fascinating. Some time for questions here. So I see David and then Sami.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So my question is, I'm gonna ask the question. I'm gonna explain it. So, like, what is the child? Like, what is the child that you're like, or youth? You know, you're focused on youth. Like, what is the youth? And the reason I ask that is that, so like, you know, in the Aristotelian schema, the women and children typically have proximity to potential, right? And so women are childlike. For that reason, and what the state does is it cultivates children to reproduce the state. Modernity changes that, right? So potential becomes just this locus of creativity, of novelty, of change, and so on. And the thing is that by the time you get to German Romanticism, you really see that come through with the Bildungsroman, the coming-of-age story. But even like 20 years after your writing, you have like Adorno and Horkheimer come and have their in the sort of dialectic of enlightenment. And when they talk about the child, they're like, well, this isn't this way that we look at the child as potential as a ruse. The child is imprinted by ideology and merely and still does reproduce the state. Your way, as I was like listening to this, it seemed like the way that you were thinking of the child was very German, and so is the child a sociological category or is it a historical category? Why is it? Is it merely an accident that your conception of the child just happens to reflect German ideology? And how would you account then for the tension between, right at the end where you said they went to abroad, right? They learned these things, they came back, they were supposed to, they were supposed to serve their homeland, the Aristotelian schema, and yet Tajadud, we're seeing modernization's true face, right? So it seems like there are these sort of conflicting accounts of childhood that don't permit for childhood to be reduced to an analytic category divorced from how that category is being produced discursively within the particular context that you're looking at. So that's my question. What is a child?
Well, first and foremost, the concept of the youth and Javan, essentially, it wasn't only, the way they used it was essentially an antithesis to everything that was backward and traditional. The concept of youth itself was used previously by Hassan Taqizadeh and Iranian modernists or the youth societies in Iran. So I think the way they understood youth was both a German conception, of course, due to their presence and education in Germany, but also from an Iranian sense, based on how it was interpreted during the constitutional revolution and as essentially as a rejuvenation of society. But I would say there is, of course, multiple points of interest. So you have youth as a generational turnover, so it's only like sociological in a sense, but it's also a concept that it's supposed to be a motivating factor for a nation to essentially overcome all forms of habit. Youth is essentially the new man, the new woman, new ideas, new habits that can be formed. And I think especially for the students, what youth meant was one, in both generationally, sociologically, and conceptually as a term, it meant that one was not beholden by the past, that one was not molded by habit, which had, as one ages, essentially, you're more and more molded by your habit, you have certain ideas, you may become more conservative or whichever other ideological current you're part of. But what they were calling for is that what youth enables, especially during the post-war period, is an openness to all possibilities, to a sense of innovation, to a sense to be able to pivot economically, ideologically, if the moment necessitates it. And this was especially so in the post-war period, not only in the Iranian sense, but in Germany as well, because there was a lot of discussion about concepts of youth in Germany during the 1920s, because the capability to self-fashion oneself had become so much more broader, that so many older forms of identity were collapsing, forms of statehood were collapsing. The Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the German Empire had all collapsed, and in their wake, there was the establishment of Bolshevism in Soviet Russia, social democracy in Germany. And all these ideas that were now possible or had been theorized in the past were becoming possible in the post-war period, even more so than during the 19th century. So I think for them, when they spoke of youth, it wasn't necessarily molding the child in terms of, it was a bit of that in terms of molding the adolescents through education and new values and stuff, of course. But it was conceptually it meant being open to everything that is now available. Don't hold on to these past dogmas and traditions. Be open to change if you need to change your own self, your own sense of identity, your own beliefs, your relations with the opposite sex, your understanding of religion, your understanding of civic duty to the state, but also the state composed of these individuals should be ready to pivot. I hope that somewhat answers the question.
That's enlightening.
Yes.
Yeah,
Wow.
we can talk about that.
Okay.
I have follow-ups on that one. Maybe Sharmin is next. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. So we have seen within the last few years that the historiography of modern Middle East is taking issue with the concepts of development, progress, modernization, and seeing this binary between like the tradition, modernity, backwardness, being progressive, somewhat limiting, and trying to find like a non-linear logic or framework for thinking about social change.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking particularly about Sarah Percy's work about Iraq, especially because of her engagement with youth, with the category of youth. So I'm thinking, is there any way that your archive invites us to think about Iranian modernity outside of this backward, progressive senses? Can we think about, because what I got from your examples, and I'm sure that they were selective examples, is that the Iranian future, it looks like the West present. So, and I saw that in terms of like women, technological reform, agriculture. So what they're aspiring to be the future of Iran is very, very much inspired by their seeing as their present reality. But is there any way in which we think of more creative ways of thinking, of people, these young people, as object, but also of agents of governmentality. And I'm thinking of that in its very Foucaultian sense, like how they basically, like an alternative, something that help us to think outside of this, like West, East, like past, present, future. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. What I was hoping to show was that their understanding of modernity itself was what is modern was itself very much contested in the West. So what is the new woman was itself being contested in the West. So when they're saying this is the new woman, it will bring progressive ideas and new modes of conduct between genders and equal opportunity, that in itself was being attacked in Germany because some of the German conservatives and German reformers looked at America as the future, both utopian and dystopian. That the ones who were reformers were looking at America and saying, this is what we have to become. They went to the United States, looked at the middle-class family, the scientific positioning of the kitchen, for instance, and how the housewife was becoming technocratic in a way, how factories were set up, and this was this utopia that Germany should become in order to avert the conflicts that had taken place and for it to become once again strong. Because Germany in the post-war order was essentially isolated, academically, commercially, and that's one reason it looked toward the East, such as Iran, to establish commercial relations and ties. Other German conservatives looked at United States as this dystopia, that this is not what we want to become. The American woman is masculine. She has no femininity. She is essentially becoming an android. And if we become that, we will lose all sense of German culture, as a German culture, but in a broader sense. German communists were also looking at the Soviet Union in a futurist sense. They were looking that this is the type of future that Germany should establish, that Germany hopes to establish. Soviet communists, even during, Bolshevists, before the Tsarist Empire collapsed, they looked at Europe as well. This is what the new man is. This is what we hope to achieve. German nationalists, especially the Nazis, looked at Mussolini, that this is the future for Germany. This is what the new German man is going to become. So everybody at that point was looking at somewhere and using it as a frame of reference to project its own futurality, essentially. So it wasn't just Iranians. And I think by showing these multiple lines of communication and adoption and reflection and criticism, we can see that this post-war modernity, it wasn't necessarily bringing the West to the East. It was happening across the transatlantic. It was happening within Europe. It was happening in multitude of directions. Even National Socialism, Hitler himself very much looked towards Ataturk as an example for what a charismatic leader can be. So they also looked towards the East for this future of Nazi Germany, essentially. So there were multiple lines going on. And interestingly, Mogaddam's play Jafar Khan as Kharij, as Farang Omad, thank you. Or he went by the pen name Ali Noruz. They also printed it in Farangistan as a critique of what is happening in Iran. That in this dystopia of future Iran and this love for all things European, there's this nonsensical words that are mixed with French and like German and Persian, and people are dressed weirdly, mishmash of different fashions and stuff. And no matter what your degree is or what your specialty is, if you just walk into any ministry with some kind of European degree, they're going to give you a job. Even it doesn't matter if you're qualified or not. And they were using this as a criticism, essentially, of hoping that this doesn't become Iran, that they just unconditionally love everything that is coming from Europe. So, yeah.
Two brief remarks and then a real question. One of the address of one of the journals that was printed was Markenhütterstraße 30 in Berlin. That happens to be very close to where the majority of Iranian restaurants still are. Secondly, I think the notion of youth might be slightly misplaced in this connection, particularly in connection with the first question, because I think Germans distinguish university students from youth, and in a way that's described quite extensively in Henry Shesky's book Einsamkeit und Freiheit, which appeared in the late 60s, I think. But the main issue I wanted to raise is, well, everything you said seems to me to have an almost exact parallel with what happened in the time I spent in East and West Germany in the late 60s and early 70s. Lots of foreign students, both from Asia and the Middle East and North America. Lots of political activities. You know, the treatment, the mistreatment of Adorno at the Universität and Frankfurt, and the development of ideas of Staatsmonopol, Kapitalismus, and things like that, all seem to be and development of different ideas about sexual relationships of various sorts. And what I wanted to ask you, which is maybe partially answered in what you did at the end, was whether, as somewhat happened at that time, some of the people who came to learn ended up being a part of the German political and cultural experience themselves. Because, for example, I studied German with a guy named Gaston Salvatore, who was the nephew of one of the leaders of Chile at the time, Salvador Allende, and he ended up translating Che Guevara with Rudi Dutschke and becoming a relatively famous German cultural figure who helped Enzensberger, who just died the other day, formed the journal Transatlantic. I'm just curious whether people from Iran sort of switched allegiances and became kind of part of the German culture instead of going back home in the Weimar area.
No, that's definitely a good point that you raised. And through my work, I also hope to show that this process that was happening during the 60s with the Iranian Students' Union that was in Germany at the time and in Europe protesting against Mohammad Reza Shah, it had precedence in Weimar Germany, because it, just like West Germany, Weimar had this space of political freedom somewhat until the later stages when they really started cracking down on all forms of revolutionary networks. So I would say, yes, Iranians were impacted by the movements in Europe during the 1960s. However, there is scholarship, especially a work by Quinn Slobodian called Foreign Front, where it was Asian and African migrants, especially Iranians, he has a chapter on that, chapter 4, I believe, that it was Iranian students that radicalized German students and made them aware of third world conflicts, not the other way around. That through their political protests against the Shah, as well as African students and other Asian students in Germany, they made Germany aware to this in these third world problems and American imperialism in the East and governments of that were essentially oppressive governments, and brought Germans into those protests. And when the Shah, for instance, visited in '67, and there were the protests in Berlin and Heidelberg, German police was essentially telling Iranian students who were suspected of being activists to stay home, don't come out, because then they would be dragging the German students out with them. And Benny Onezorg, the one who got shot in Germany, was essentially attending a rally that was being fought between the Shah's bodyguards, who were students supporting the Shah in Germany, and protesters. So that book, I think, is a very fascinating book because it shows that these currents of revolutionary thought and radicalism were not, again, going from west to the east. It was Easterners and Africans that were bringing it and radicalizing the West.
Except the other half of Germany was reading picture books about the Shah's family.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really? I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Krista.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was very interested in your part of the presentation where you sort of talked about the gendered experience of the new woman in Germany and those interactions with the Iranian students. And I was curious as if you have any sort of views or work done on how that impacted family units that then remained either in Germany or remained as a sort of mixed blend.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this because I've done passion projects about post-World War II Germany with the, like, American occupation soldiers and German women, and the experiences of their progeny and their children, both in the US and Germany. So I just wanted to know if you had any opinions or any work pertaining to, you know, perhaps the blended results of Iranian and German culture in the interwar period.
Yeah, I have some projects in mind involving Iranians in Nazi Germany with German women and such. But in terms of the family unit and such, and if that impacted Iranians when they return home, I'm mostly reminded of Afsan and Najmabadi's work of the love marriages, for instance, becoming more and more prominent in Iran, that the idea that marriage shouldn't be arranged, you need to essentially meet the person and fall in love with them, because this will create a much more holistic family for the good for the child and such. So I'm sure many of these Iranians returning home and their interaction with European women who were now becoming more and more independent in the post-war period because there was more jobs for them available, and so they didn't need to rely on their husbands, or they rely on their fathers or brothers to take care of them. I'm sure these ideas or these changes in society impacted also their conception of the family. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, please.
I think it was a very stimulating talk given by you. I have a very, just a recent question about the recent developments in Iran. I mean, the protests going on day by day, and what do you think the future prospects of this particular, turmoil?
Yeah.
Will they be crushed by hardliners, or will the students will succeed?
The hardliners.
Will this movement be crushed by the hardliners, the religious fanatics?
Yeah.
Or the students will succeed in their demands?
Okay. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that, but I think also if we reflect on history, not only during this period, not only during the 1960s, we can see how much youth, however you want to categorize them, whether it's adolescence or all the way to 1930s, there's several works dedicated to what is essentially who is youth, what is young, and who fits into that category. But if you want to say it's teenagers in 1920s or early 1930s, we can see that they are actively involved in shaping their futures. They are actively involved in pushing for change. So, and we see that today in the streets of Iran, that they are essentially pushing for change that is meaningful for them and hoping to change the political future of the country according to their own conceptions of the future and what Iran should be for them.
And of course, today is the National Student Day in Iran.
So it's very apt.
Okay, let's just come to some final words here before we close. I have Milad and then a comment in the back of the list.
I guess I want to re-ask that question in a different way.
Okay.
It seems to be that there is some kind of a coincidence, right, of this history that you give us and the kind of social protests that are happening today. The idea of the independent woman, the new woman, sort of self-assertion of the youth against traditional religious authority. You sort of historicize it. Here, in like when we look at the process, it's sort of taken at face value. This is what we see: youth and women asserting themselves against forces and authorities that, however you want to describe them, are in contentions with them. So how does this historicization and the coincidence of a certain, what you presented as ideology and political outlook of a group of young students in Germany, and I mean those are terms or analytic terms, right?
Yeah.
Political outlook or ideology, and that of the protest social movements in Iran today. What do you make of that coincidence?
And can I ask, is this on the same question, the same topic that you have something to do with? No, it's not. Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to know a comment from you. It doesn't have to do with this period.
Yeah.
It has to do with the current period, which seems that we're going back to more conservatism in many countries, like Indonesia, Turkey, and Iran.
Yeah.
And I mean, things seem to go around depending on the politics. But I wanted, if you could, comment on that.
Okay, so yeah, just.
And if you can't because it's a little off the subject, that's fine too.
So we'll leave you the final word, Sheragim.
Okay. In regard to Milad's question, I wouldn't say it's a coincidence at all, because I feel that as long as states are trying to mold these perfect functional citizens through education or through indoctrination or sending them abroad, there's always this agency in the self to make an impact, to craft your own future, your own identity. So that's happening then, that was happening during the 60s, that's happening now, despite this overarching emphasis to create these citizens that are going to aid the state. There's always this self-agency that is going to rebel against that, essentially. And I think that's going to go beyond the questions of history and such. So I wouldn't phrase it as a coincidence whatsoever. And in regards to the other question, I think we also have to think about, when you say societies are becoming more and more conservative, is which aspect of the society. If you're talking about in Iran, you could say it's mostly those supporting the government or the government itself, not necessarily the majority of the population. And maybe the same thing for Indonesia or Turkey, perhaps in another way. Perhaps sometimes Turkey can go the other way, where historically the state was very much secular, and whenever there were moments of danger to that secularism, the military would step in and shut down any type of religious takeover. But now, but the people perhaps are more religious than the state was previously, and now the state in Turkey is reflecting on the will of the people. So I think that we have to make distinctions between which sectors of each country we're talking about.
Okay, please join me in once again thanking. And thank you all for being with us this semester. It's been a real delight to have you every day. We have a jam-packed schedule for next semester planned as well, so do stay tuned for the announcement of that schedule. It should be up on the website shortly. Otherwise, we'll have our presentation by Ariel Fani next week on Zoom, and everyone have a wonderful